I'm JJ Perez with Inside Runner Sports. That's Greg Luca from the San Antonio Express News. We are here to recap and rewind UTSA's season opening loss to Houston on Saturday. Greg, the Roadrunners fall 17 to 14. Kind of a weird game, I think. UTSA's offense struggled offensively. They did put up some yards, but only were able to get in the end zone twice. The UH defense looked pretty good. And, just overall, not a clean performance by UTSA.
Yeah, I think that word clean is important. I think that's where I would probably start with the analysis of this one because there's a lot of different ways you could take it. But to me, it comes down to a lot of different mistakes that UTSA made in different facets of the game. You can look at Frank Harris's three interceptions on three straight throws, which was only the second time in his career he's been intercepted three times in a game. Or you can look at some of the things that happened on special teams that I think led to some points for Houston. Or you can take a look at the penalties for UTSA that I think were costly in different phases of the game. So it's a lot of stuff that's been kind of uncharacteristic and not necessarily just line up and X's and O's offense, defense stuff. It's little, I don't know if it's mental mistakes because a lot of that is physical as well, but it's just
Yeah.
little things that were a bit out of line that led to a loss in this one, I think.
Let's unpack quarterback Frank Harris's play in week one. He didn't look great. I know the interceptions are going to get a lot of the attention, but I noticed his overall accuracy was just a little bit off. And while he's been a full go, I think in most of the fall practices, we do know he was limited before that to, not doing anything because of all the offseason issues he had with his knee surgery, the infection, and the additional surgeries and having to come back and rehab. So it seems like that kind of took a little bit of a toll on Frankie. He's not, I wouldn't say he's hurt or injured. It just seems like he's rusty a little bit.
Yeah, I think, Jeff Traylor said as much that Frank has to play his way back into shape a little bit here, just in terms of the rhythm of the game. And I think there were times that maybe you saw some of that. UTSA was flagged for having an ineligible, I can speak, man downfield a couple times. And it was on those RPO plays where maybe Frank's just not getting the ball out in the normal rhythm. And so the offensive line is farther past the line of scrimmage than they should be. And, maybe just nobody was open and that would have happened either way. But I think there were cases where sometimes it felt like the offensive line held up a little bit better than I was actually expecting in this game, where Frank had some time to make a couple reads and make a decision. And then either nobody was open, which you can talk about not having Zachary Franklin, you can talk about not having JT Clark out there. And basically it was Joshua Cephas and a lot of guys who were much more unproven. And that was basically Frank's targets that he could work with in that game. And then on the interceptions, the other thing about that is he doesn't play against defenses with this caliber of athlete only so many times in his career. And you look at two of them in particular, the second one to Cephas was the deep shot down the right sideline.
Yeah.
And, a lot of times you're just going to take a shot and maybe that play gets intercepted. But I thought the other two were a little bit more telling because the first one, it's like 3rd and 11. He tries to fit in the curl pass to Houston Thomas. And a lot of times I think the teams that they're playing against, the defender doesn't read that and
That was an
react to it
amazing play. That was an
and have the
amazing
athleticism
interception.
jump in front of it. And
Yeah.
then the other one was a case of I think even an even better example of that, where it's that throwback across his body rolling to his left that you can get away with in Conference USA, and you just kind of can't against Houston. So I think that maybe it was a level of the competition, maybe it was under some pressure, maybe it was the targets, and maybe it was some rust. And I think it all just kind of came together from different phases to see a little bit less than we're used to. And even that being said, there were times down the stretch where I thought, oh, look, it's dog. There were times down the stretch where I thought UTSA was going to pull out another miracle, and they had they had that touchdown drive there at the end with the incredible play by Cephas to get in the end zone, and then it felt like they were going to get a stop and do what they always do and pull this one out at the end. So despite all the negative things you can say, they were still right there in it.
Yeah, I think Frank did a good job of keeping the Roadrunners in it and in the game. I mean, obviously that third quarter stretch with the three interceptions was bad, but I mean to me the one where the defender made the amazing play, I think it was inside the red zone. That was the most critical one because that took points off the board. And in a tight game like that, there were a handful of plays where we saw points come off the board, whether it was the illegal formation on the field goal
Mhm.
or, I mean, the punt return that they gave up
Yeah.
that set up a touchdown. So any one of those plays, you nitpick the Frank interceptions, but any one of those plays go another way, and this game might turn out different.
Or even you can look at the end of the first half, the penalty against Danye Taylor for the late hit out of bounds, where it takes what it would have been a 45-yard field goal instead
Yes,
of 31 because they marked off half the distance. And
yes.
maybe Houston's kicker misses it if it's a 45-yard field goal. So there was a lot of these little things that added up. And in the moment, I didn't really feel like compared to last year's game, where last year it seemed really evident to me that UTSA was the better team and it felt like they deserved to win. And a lot of the metrics kind of bared that out at the end of the day. And it was funny because last year, I did a little comparison this morning. Last year, UTSA averaged 6 yards per play and Houston averaged 4.6. And this year, UTSA averaged 5.9 yards per play and Houston averaged 4.6. So it was right there. I mean, if you look at like UTSA's EPA margin was better than last year, but Houston's success rate was better this year. Like, if you want to get into the weeds on all that stuff, I don't think statistically this is going to be as improbable as last year's loss was. I think it'll probably play out a little bit more likely that Houston at least closer to deserve to win this one than they did last year. But I still think that UTSA in the big picture was right there, which makes those mistakes that we talked about even more punishing.
Before I want to talk about the defense because it feels like they deserve some flowers after this performance. But I want to stay on the offense because we saw Kavorian Barnes have a big performance. We saw Joshua Cephas have a big performance. UTSA was without JT Clark. He did make the trip, but he did not dress. He watched on the sidelines without pads, and I mean, the offense looked out of rhythm for most of the game. I think they scored on their second drive, and then it was just something like 6 straight or 7 straight drives of nothing. I mean, just punt, field goal miss, interception, interception, punt, punt. So um, I think probably that had a lot to do with the Houston defense, maybe as much as the offense not being as good. But it could be too early to tell, I think.
Yeah, it's always really hard in week one. If Houston wins the Big 12 or something crazy like
Yeah.
that, we're going to get this a lot differently. So we'll just have to see how it unfolds and then how that sort of leads our coloring of how we see this game going back at it. But I think the running game for UTSA, when you want to talk about the offense, was particularly impressive, I thought,
Yeah.
especially compared to last year where that was a point of emphasis. I think they had something like 45 yards rushing from running backs last year that Coach Traylor sort of harped on a bit. And this game, I think it was 133, if I remember
Yeah.
right, between
Yeah.
three guys. And Kavorian Barnes was up over 100. And I think that plays into, like we mentioned, the offensive line maybe holding up a little bit better than expected. And also just Kavorian looked really potent with what he was able to do with some of the opportunities, breaking some tackles and things like that. So there is plenty to be encouraged about on the offensive front, especially when you think about the way a receiver like JT Clark coming back at whatever point that happens changes sort of the dimensions of the field for UTSA and the way
Yeah.
teams have to defend them. It kind of opens that up even more. So if they're already having some success running the ball, and that was without maybe Frank being as involved in that running game as he usually is, and without the kind of deep downfield threat that they often have on the outside, then I think that bodes pretty well for what they'll do against a lot of defenses that won't be as strong as this one as well. Although Houston's defense was pretty bottom tier last year, so if it's unless they make huge strides, maybe
Yeah.
it's not encouraging. It just kind of depends.
Right. Just to wrap up the offense here, we were told JT Clark was a game time decision. It looked like watching in pregame that they made that decision pretty early because he wasn't participating in the pregame stuff, at least
Yeah,
when
I
we
mean,
got there, right?
when I first got there and I looked out on the field, he was, a lot of guys are out there stretching at that time. And
Yeah.
it's not even like the whole roster's out there. It's just whoever kind of wants to get some early work in. And they had a line of wide receivers and he was in the line doing stuff. I mean, I didn't see closely if he was, we know from just what we've seen on practice clips that get posted on social media that he's at least been out there running routes and doing things every once in a while, even if he's been non-contact. So I don't think that there was any sort of deception in terms of how they approached it with us
Right.
leading up to the game. I think that he was probably ramping up his activity through the fall, and it was probably pretty questionable whether he would make it today. But sometimes you're just going to, on that day, if he feels like he can do it, maybe he can do it. And if he doesn't feel like he can do it, he can't do it. And he's got to look out for his future and potential for the NFL and all of that as well. So I think it just was probably genuinely that kind of a decision, but it did seem like, he didn't even, we've seen game time decisions in the past where the guy
Yeah.
puts the helmet on and puts the pads on and goes through that part of it too. He didn't have to get to that stage to make the call. He probably knew either before he got there that day or just from kind of moving around a little bit a couple hours before the game that it wasn't going to happen.
So UTSA was out was without JUCO transfer Willie McCoy. It looked like he had something with his hand. I think we saw Dan Dishman go down in this game as well. I think I saw him on the sidelines in street clothes at the end of the game. So a lot of two tight ends. Houston Thomas obviously made a big catch. Cam Cooper played a lot. They threw in those three freshman wide receivers, so lots of young guys getting time.
Yeah, I looked at the PFF stuff a little bit, and I don't know if it's all been verified or whatever, but it seemed like it said I think they played 23 guys on offense and 28 on defense, which
Yeah, it's a
is pretty high
lot.
there. And I think they were trying to make sure that nobody got worn down. And then there's also some level of just wanting to give people an opportunity and feel
Yeah,
out who can do what. So between all those different factors, I think that there was probably a lot higher number of guys involved in the mix than you would previously see. I mean, we saw Jace Wilson played a couple snaps. We saw
yeah.
Devin McQueen played a couple snaps, and David Amador played a couple snaps and even got the ball a couple times. So I just think that they were really trying to explore all their options while keeping everybody fresh. And so that was interesting to see. Houston Thomas was one that surprised me too, but I didn't notice that Dishman got hurt. So that explains that because Dishman didn't play a ton of snaps overall.
Yeah, let's jump over to the defensive side. Man, just a really good overall performance by UTSA's defense. Maybe they weren't able to get off the field in that late game situation, but I mean, other than that, I you can't ask the positions they were put in by the turnovers and some of the special teams miscues. Obviously, they played well.
Yeah, and I thought even some of the plays that Houston hit, some of these pass plays that converted, I really thought they were UTSA guys were in pretty good position to make a play on
Right.
it. I just think, across the board, they played probably better than I would have expected for that group. And we've talked a lot about the defensive front in particular and how deep they are, that they go three deep across that rotation. And that obviously comes into play in a game like this where you are cycling through so many guys and where your offense is out there for one or two plays, three drives in a row, and you have
Thrown
to
back
break
out
that
there. Yeah.
right back on the field. So I think that the level of depth that they've developed on that side really paid off. I mean, Jeff Traylor said during the week they'd play five guys at linebacker and the inside linebacker spot. And I think they ended up doing that. Maybe obviously some a lot more than others, but everybody who he mentioned was on the field. And, maybe the depth at the outside linebacker positions isn't great. I think they're pretty reliant on Trey Moore for some pass rushing. And I think that Danye obviously made some mistakes that we've already highlighted, but I thought he made a lot of big plays too on the other side. I think those two guys need to play a ton of snaps if UTA is going to be effective, but they have some options at cornerback that they can work through, and they have some guys at safety they can work through. So really, those outside linebacker spots are the only positions where depth-wise, I feel like they aren't as comfortable rotating through a bunch of different people who can produce at a high level. So I think when you have a game with the elements a little bit like it was yesterday, you really see that come into focus.
I didn't write up too much about the elements, but it was hot, and I mean
Yeah,
that was a factor in the game. And we saw guys go down with cramps, and they were rotating the linemen in and out mid series. It looked like a lot, and I mean that was a huge factor. I think.
and who knows if that comes into play at the very end there when Houston's trying to run out the clock and
Yeah,
UTSA needs a little more stop to be able to get the offense back on the field if they're just kind of out of gas at this point. I think I'd have to double check the time of possession. Yeah, it was about even. I was going to say, I think because of some of the
yeah,
special team stuff that maybe the defense wasn't out there as long as they could have been. Just there was like a short field or two, like that first touchdown that you mentioned. So
yeah.
generally, it was going to be tough no matter how many minutes you were out there. I think it
Right.
ended up being about an even split, but you don't know if that wore them down a little bit at the end, especially when you get to that third set of downs, that eighth or ninth play of that sequence. There, you're going to be having a hard time really bringing the same juice that you did at the start of the drive.
Yeah, I don't know that. I think I went up to you at one point in the game, just jumping over to the special teams. I was trying to count how many, I guess, miscues there were, and it felt like it was maybe more than it was, maybe because some of the punts, and I think Chris Carpenter muffed a kickoff return or whatever.
Yeah, that was like 15 seconds after you
After,
asked. Immediately he botched that one. Yeah.
I mean,
So
all that stuff seems like it's correctable. Like it doesn't seem major stuff, and I don't know that we have I didn't watch the illegal formation lining up over the snapper penalty, but there were some questionable calls by this officiating crew. So who knows? But I mean, it seems like most of the special team stuff is not dire.
yeah, that's always such a small part of the game relative to
Yeah,
the other two phases, in my opinion. And I just think that a lot of that stuff, like you said, is just you're not going to drop a ton of kickoffs and pick them up at the 3 yard line. You're not going to give up a lot of 50-yard punt returns just because if it was a trend where we'd seen UTSA struggle in those areas in recent years, it would be a different thing. But I don't know that that's been one of their calling cards that I would point to. And I think one of the reasons maybe it felt like more special teams than others is, well, we were kind of looking at the kicker position coming in,
Yeah.
thinking, is it going to be something that's a little bit of a problem? And Tate Sandell puts one off the right upright there, which, in a 3-point game that obviously mattered. And we've seen Lucas Dean be such an awesome punter for a few years here. His first one goes out of bounds, and then later he had one that went, I think, like 24, 26 yards,
Yep.
something like that. So that was highly uncharacteristic. And so it's just things that we were either focused on or were surprised by, I guess, that
Right.
maybe made it stand out a little bit more. And then I think the play at the end of the first half we talked about where Houston's field goal got cut in half, my brain kind of lumped that into special teams. That's more of a defensive issue, but I do think that you sort of think about it in the same vein there. So it was obviously a huge factor in the game. If they flip all of those, it's hard to imagine that it wouldn't be a different outcome, but I don't know that long term, it's to your point that it's something that they have to be worried about.
Week one loss to start the 2023 season, Greg, that UTSA lost week one in 2022, and that season turned out okay. You think they kind of use this as a building block moving forward? It seems like there were a lot of positives they could take out of this game.
I do have some big picture thoughts, but before we move on, I want to ask you about the spot at the end on the
Oh,
last
yes, yes.
talking point, and I know you had
Right.
a vantage point on it, so I was wondering what you thought about that whole situation.
I couldn't tell from I was at the 25-ish or whatever where you're supposed to stand, and I was at an angle, but it looked like they picked up the ball and moved it a foot forward, and then they stretched out the chain, and I thought I saw the guy, the official, grab the chain to show how short they were going to be, and then he put it back down, and it looked like he tilted the ball so that it touched the like to check. And I know the Cowboys had a similar thing in the NFL a few years ago where the ref took out a index
Yeah,
card.
they needed that.
They totally needed that. And Jeff Traylor was standing right in front of that, and he lost it understandably because it was just a, I guess, comical situation there. And I mean, if UTSA gets off the field there, they're gonna have a chance, not a great chance, but they're gonna have
I mean, with them, it's
something.
always a great chance, right? Like they've done that so many times before. You
So
would have felt pretty good about that with a
yeah,
minute five and no timeouts. They could get it done because that's just what they do. But watching it back, I watched it 15 minutes ago before we started doing this. I think the first spot was horrific. Like it was a yard
yes.
short of where the ball actually was. So that's where the issue begins, is
And
that
they
they were so
reviewed
far
that,
off.
right?
Yeah. So then when they review it, they moved it up to the 48, which looked, I mean, it was at least a lot closer than the first spot. I don't know
Yeah,
where exactly the elbow went down and where the ball was. And
yeah.
honestly, we should blame FS1 because I don't know why there's not a side angle.
Right. What are
Maybe
they
they
doing?
had it. Maybe they had it and they didn't show it to us, but it didn't sound like it existed, which you would
Yeah,
think for a national game, really any game at this point in time, that for a critical play like that, you would have that side angle, which would really solve this pretty quickly. But we're looking at from the end zone angles and from like
yeah.
the hard
Angle.
cam,
Yeah.
like the usual zoomed out view of trying to figure it out that way. And I think to your point about kind of nudging the ball when they reset it, and they went to pull the chains out to measure, it was like the guy clipped it on the way past with the chains, and the
Yes.
other ref was like trying to hold it back to where they had put it. And
Yeah.
I don't know if it moved in that process or not, but we're talking about like a millimeter that makes a
Right.
difference in this game. So I can see where anybody would be upset about that. And yeah, I don't know. Maybe the chains is not exact enough science. Like, what if he's at like an 89-degree angle instead of a 90-degree angle? Like I don't know if we have this technology perfect on the measurements, but clearly every little tiny fraction mattered in that case. And I don't. Even if UTSA gets that call, there's a lot of work to do there.
Right.
Or uh, I mean, who knows if Houston lines up and punches it 1 inch to get
Right.
the first
Yeah.
down and end the game anyway. But
Well,
like,
victory. Yeah.
there's so I understand why that stuck with some people, but I wouldn't get too caught up on that exact moment over the whole course of everything that happened in the game.
Yeah, no, for sure. A very interesting end to the game there. Big picture, Greg, I think, the Roadrunners are going to be okay. Obviously, they're going to have a pretty interesting week two matchup here. We could talk about it in a little bit, but I think they could take a lot from this loss and kind of build on it.
Yeah, I think you don't. I said earlier, week one is so tough, and you don't really know who
Yeah.
you're playing and who you are and how it's going to look at the end of the season. But I do want to. I don't want to overreact, but don't want to underreact either, because you only get so many cracks at a game like this that if you win it, it really changes how people think about you and your program and your season and everything else. And, it's the kind of game that if you want to play in a New Year's Six Bowl, you'd have to win it. And if you want to
Yeah,
be in the top 25, you have to win it. And if you think Frank Harris could win the Heisman, it needs to go better than this. That's, that stuff is probably off the table for at least until something happens or way down the road where you start to say, has UTSA done enough to get back in that mix? And I mean, even if you want to talk about like the buzz around Jeff Traylor getting considered for other jobs, like even that kind of takes a hit here. And obviously, that's not something that's probably a positive, if anything, for the UTSA fans that you can take away from this. But I do think that, especially with UTSA's profile being on the rise, you look at the future schedules and the Power Five teams that they're slated to play are Texas, Texas A&M, and LSU. It's going to be hard to get games against a team like Houston. I mean, it would be awesome if Houston decided to continue the
why would
series.
they want to play them? I mean, you almost
But
lost to them twice, 2 years in a
right.
row.
But so it's going to be harder and harder to get in a
Yeah,
position where you are up against a team that is theoretically a level higher and that it would boost your profile to beat, but and to actually have that kind of a game on the schedule. So I see from that perspective where you would want to take advantage of it. If people are acting like UTSA is in trouble and they're not going to compete for the American championship, I think that would be pretty out of line. I mean, just based on
yeah,
one game, especially if, to Traylor's point, if Frank Harris is going to round into form in some way where he's even better than he was in this game, where they still almost had a chance to win it at the end, I do think that it's way too early to start to worry about the long term. But I do think we don't want to gloss over this as a missed opportunity that could have been big for the program. And you think about how many months people spent looking forward to this game and wanting it to go a different way. And in a lot of cases, very confident that it would, just because of how strong UTSA looked last year and how much turnover Houston had versus how much continuity UTSA had. I really thought, I mean, I don't do picks, but I thought UTSA was going to come out in this game and win it because they obviously are entering this new league with championship expectations, and this program is on the rise. And Traylor's one of the hottest names in coaching. And you look at Houston, and they were wildly disappointing last year. And going to the Big 12, it's like, we're going to need time to compete. And is Holgerson on the hot seat? Like, it's such a different kind of
yeah.
vibe that I really thought that that sort of thing was enough that UTSA just common sense felt like they were the team that was poised to win this one, and then it just doesn't go that way. So it's a little bit of a missed opportunity, but it's not going to derail the whole season.
Right. That's why you play the games on the field. You got to hash it out between the lines. So the Roadrunners 0-1 move on to week 2, Greg, against their heated rival. I mean, across all sports at UTSA, Texas State is the school that moves the needle. The Bobcats are under first year head coach GJ Kenny. They score maybe the upset of week 1. Right? I mean, Colorado and TCU was pretty good too, but a pretty big shocker in Waco yesterday, and a pretty scary looking offense. I don't know if you got to see any of the numbers or any of the highlights, but man, they look. I thought they were going to be good maybe next season. It looked they did put together a pretty good recruiting class, a whole new group of players on the roster, but they look like they're going to have something this year.
Yeah, I thought it was funny because I was reading about Colorado and TCU, and
Yep.
the line in the story was like, Deion Sanders is the first coach in his FBS debut to win a game as a 20-point underdog. And that lasted, like 3 hours, right? And because then Kenny did the same thing. So it speaks a little bit to the new sort of
Yep.
era of college football where you can turn the roster
The
over to that
transfer portal,
level
man, it's crazy.
and have these instant results. But there's probably two sides to that coin where it probably makes you incredibly hard to scout when
Yeah.
you have a new coach and an entirely new roster. And so maybe that once they put some stuff on film, it gets a little bit easier for teams to contend with them going forward. Or maybe they're just that good. Maybe they found all the right pieces and they've adapted to the system seamlessly, and these coaches are doing an outstanding job. So again, you don't want to read too much into week 1, but for Texas State, why not take the opportunity to celebrate that? It's been a rough couple of years for your program, and I think this is the first time they've ever beaten a Power 5 team. So from that perspective, it's going to be something that they can hang their hat on for a long time. And we saw them last year pull a 20-point something upset against Appalachian State, and it just didn't create any momentum for them. So it's only as good as you really build on it, even if it's something that your people are going to want to point to for years and years to come. What it means for this season, it doesn't guarantee anything, but certainly I think that compared to what I thought about this game a week ago, it's a lot more interesting now. You would think that UTSA might be coming off a big win, and Texas State was probably going to be coming off a 20-something point loss. And this was just one where UTSA would be a 20-something point favorite and it could probably just roll through it. And we'd have this cute angle about GJ Kinney and Jeff Traylor and their connection. And then that would carry us through the weekend. We'd be on to the next one. But I think all of a sudden, this is a game that looks highly competitive and deserves to be paid a lot of attention to from the X's and O's part as much as anything else.
Yep, a very spicy matchup. It looks like it's brewing for Saturday afternoon at the Alamo Dome. Greg, my last question for you here before we wrap this up. You think we see Frank Harris bounce back for a big game, or does he need to maybe work himself into the season a little bit more?
We already saw him bounce back in the last drive yesterday. I mean, I don't think stuff really rattles him at this stage of his career. And I there's been this is one of those things that happens with social media. I've seen people saying that people are turning on Frank. I haven't actually seen the people who have turned on Frank. Maybe
I,
you're
I could,
deeper.
yeah, I could show you. There, I have
You're deeper in
receipts.
the weeds on that
Yes,
than I am.
yeah,
But if there's enough maybe negative social media buzz that he gets hold of and that starts to
yeah,
get in his, but he's used to that part of it too. So I really don't imagine that anything is going to affect him and that he'll be any different next week. If anything, he'll be better because typically he's been better than this.
yeah, yeah. I think more it's a function of UTSA is kind of a little bit more popular now. They're a little bit of a more of a household name, so you have a little bit more of the fringe fans that
Right. Right.
are not necessarily invested
Or
in
maybe
and
haven't seen him play
yeah,
more than once or twice. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, so they have a very short, fuse, and I that's a lot of what I've seen, to be honest with you. I haven't seen the fan base.
Right. The OGs. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
They
So,
know they've been riding with this for a few
yep,
years. He can do and what he's already done for them. I mean, however this ends out, he could have a. I think he would have to have some kind of awful year to not still be remembered as the best player to ever come through the program, or at least most significant, or however you want to, categorize it for what he's done for this place.
yep,
So I
yep.
think that the ones who have ridden through that for a few years are not going to be the ones questioning him. But some people who flipped on FS1 and saw him for the first time and said, "Isn't this that team that was almost undefeated?" I could see where those guys
Yeah.
might be for sure.
Well, I guess we'll just wrap that one up here, Greg. Any final thoughts, or let's get to Texas State week.
Yeah, week 2, let's go.
Yep. All right, Greg. Greg Luca, San Antonio Express News, JJ Perez, Inside Runner Sports. Thanks for watching.